Hi, Elizabeth Silverstein, host of Sustaining Craft, here with a pre-interview message. This interview with Robert Bean was recorded several months ago, and I struggled to get it done with so many tech errors, which included losing my laptop unexpectedly, but I got through it and it's here. However, because of the delay, some things are out of date, like his class, which we discuss, that is long completed. Instead, I've included some resources in the description box, both for the YouTube video and the podcast, to his newsletter and website, where you can sign up to find out about upcoming classes and workshops from Robert. In addition, next week I will be publishing my interview with Brandy Mims. She is an incredible deaf dancer, but due to production delays, this will be published pretty close to her dance production on April 22nd. I will include the link for tickets to that if you're in the Little Rock area as well. Be sure to attend if you can. It will be spectacular. And now, please enjoy the interview with Robert. Hi, welcome back to Sustaining Craft. I'm your host, Elizabeth Silverstein. I'm a professional writer and full-time dog trainer, and I have with me today, back again for the third time, Robert Bean, who's a professional visual artist and instructor who works on an endless list of really cool projects and classes, like the upcoming Back to Drawing boot camp that begins on February 21st. Hi, Robert. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing all right. So the first time we talked was way back in 2018. And then we touched base again in 2020 over the pandemic, and now here we are again 3 years later to see what you've been up to. How have things been going?
Good. Busy. I was one of the people that didn't really slow down with the pandemic. I mean, I guess as an artist, especially with my studio being in my house, I was still going to work every day. Mm-hmm. And when we figured out how to do classes online, then the teaching didn't stop either. I also teach at UA Little Rock, and we pivoted online there. And so this Back to Drawing boot camp class is now something I'm doing independently. I'm doing it on my own, but it came out of that experience with learning how to do everything through Zoom and online and everything else. And so I didn't see a reason to stop doing it. Yeah. So.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I took a class with you, I think back in 2021. We did a history class about art, and that was really informative and really good. And I have to say, your method of teaching is very calming and just very welcoming. So I did appreciate that about stepping into it. And I did sign up for the class, so I'll be taking the Back to Drawing. Drawing is something I've loved ever since I was little. And as we get older, we step away from the things we love. So I did really appreciate it that it was for people that have experience, but also people that are new to it. So. Yeah. How do you set it up so that it's welcoming if you have some knowledge or if you don't?
I approach it with the class is going to be broken into each session will be an hour and a half, and I'm going to break it into basically a 45 and a 45. And then in the first 45 minutes, what we'll do is we'll talk about like basic concepts, stuff that if you're new to it, it'll be brand new, but it's like the basic things you have to learn. But if you're someone who's been drawing for a while, and I find this, I think, in every discipline, everyone does this. You get so far ahead, you stop really thinking about those little things that start it because they become kind of intuitive and you get used to them. And so sometimes it can really help to go back and hear those things again and go, oh, I haven't thought about that in a long time. And am I doing it the way I used to? Have I changed it? Stuff like that. So that first 45 minutes is designed to kind of either remind or introduce. And then the second 45 minutes is designed to talk about, well, how do you maintain the practice? That's the other thing I find that students often run into trouble with is if they're in a class, they'll work. As soon as the class is over, they don't. Or it'll be really sporadic. They'll like, I'm inspired this weekend, so I'll go in and work and stuff like that. But when you're learning how to be a professional, that's what separates you, is the ability to go in and do work. And do it daily or almost daily and actually make stuff. You can't just wait for someone to give you a prompt, although we're going to do those in the class to get you going, but you can't just wait. You have to go do it. You have to have the initiative yourself. So we'll talk about how you do that. How do you develop that practice?
Something I really wanted to touch on with you too is I think a lot about this in terms of, as a dog trainer, I have to help people with the foundations first, and we can't do
Mm-hmm.
the cool stuff unless they get the foundations down. And people don't always understand, well, what are those foundations?
Mm-hmm.
And that's important to delve into. And then I took some salsa bachata classes
Mm-hmm.
downtown at Club 27, and they were just running us through the basics level skills before we could get on to the more advanced things. And I think it's hard for people to understand outside what that looks like and how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where it's so important to have someone to coach you through it and have an instructor of like, hey, remember? Yeah, this is
Yeah.
what we do.
Yeah, exactly. Because if you don't know those things, that's what makes it frustrating.
Why aren't I good at it?
Yeah, why isn't this working? Why
Yes.
isn't this it's happening?
Mm-hmm.
Or you don't even understand how to figure out what's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a lot of students will get excited and say, I've always wanted to learn how to like paint in watercolor. I've always wanted to learn how to oil paint, but they won't learn how to draw first. And then they get really frustrated because it doesn't work the way they want it to work. And one of the things about drawing is the core idea behind drawing is it teaches you how to see. And that may sound weird to people who don't understand that, but it's the idea of when you look at something, everything is made up of these like base shapes and forms essentially. When I look at like a building, it's essentially a cube. And when I look at like, you know, even with like people, if you're drawing people, they're made up of all these smaller shapes and forms, and you have to learn how to see that and translate it. Otherwise, everything looks really flat when you draw it. So that's some of those core fundamental things that if you take the time and learn those, then when you try to paint or you try to do something else or draw, it won't be as frustrating because at least you're making it look kind of like you want it to look. Yeah.
Is it accurate to call drawing kind of the skeletal structure of like, you know, a fabric or like a, let me rephrase that. So drawing would be the bones of the painting. So the painting
Mm-hmm.
would be more of like the fabric on furniture,
Mm-hmm.
you know, whereas the drawing would be the bones of the kind of the metal or the wood underneath.
Yeah, yeah, that's kind of a good way to put it. Even with like a lot of like abstract art, if you don't understand those core fundamental concepts that you learn when you take drawing, like if you don't understand things like light and shadow, you don't understand things like movement, which is what you learn, and how shape works and how shapes relate to each other, then even your abstract art won't come across as very interesting. So while learning drawing really does help you kind of understand how to see things in a realistic manner and translate it, even when you abstract out. And this is one of the things I don't think a lot of people realize. Learning how to see is part of that abstraction process. Even if you want to do like colorful abstract paintings, it won't always work that way. So when we look at some of the best abstract artists that have ever existed, they usually could draw realistically. They learned how to do that. And so that's why something like this kind of class, I think, even if you're not like, I'm not going to draw all the time, I want to paint, it's still worth the time to learn it.
That's awesome. And that also, to like thinking about how they know abstract artists knowing how to draw realistically, they chose abstract as their self-expression, right?
Mhm.
That
Right.
was their desired
Yeah.
form. So yeah, really interesting. And it was interesting taking that class with you where you kind of delved into how, you know, how people develop styles, where those styles came from, how things were happening over time, because then you could see what impacted people and what they were drawn to. And there's a lot that impacts, you know, history, what's happening in our current time, all of that can impact our style and how we choose to express ourselves as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I try to look at it as you have to learn how to play scales on an instrument before you can play a song, and then once you learn how to play a song, then you can learn how to compose something, and the composition is what's coming from that influence of everything around you. So drawing's the same way. I learn how to draw something, and then I learn how to make a drawing, and then I go, okay, now that I've got these skills, I can start to comment on the things around me. I can start to talk about those things that are influencing me out in the world around me and stuff like that. But you do have to kind of build up to it.
There's a couple of things that are popping out to me. First, the practice, which is something you still do, even though you have many, many years under your belt as an accomplished artist, you still practice. And the second is how you allow things to impact you and to grow and learn from that. And I think it's easy for us to get stagnant when we don't allow for both of those processes to happen.
Absolutely. I use the figure a lot in my work. It tends to be a focus, drawing people. And so I like to teach figure drawing, and I practice figure drawing constantly. I work from the model, I go to sessions with models, all that kind of stuff. and I've gotten some really great work out of it. I actually have an exhibition up through the end of February at UA Little Rock right now that is called Figure Drawing On Screen and Off, and it is an educational exhibition that has, every piece has a wall tag with a full explanation of that piece, what was going on. I list all the like materials, I list the time, where the model was, because it's kind of going through what figure drawing was before the pandemic, what happened during the pandemic, when it went online, and what it's like now. And if you go through, it has this like order where you can read the whole thing and you get this idea of what it's like. But that also shows the practice. It shows what goes into the process. It shows what the artist, goes through. And I think you can't have the expression without the practice as easy. I think it's better when they work together, that tension between the practice and the expression. So yeah, what you're saying is exactly that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. And that's, I think that's something that has stuck out to me before, is that you really like to document and show stories, even though if you're not telling a specific story in a piece, there is a whole story there. And if people want to delve into it, they can find that. And that comes, I know from your past, we talked about that in the first interview we did, of how you grew up reading comic books and how that story is important to you. So how has that embrace of the story, has that changed for you over the pandemic? Because I know you've used the pandemic now. How have you considered story in, I guess, more recent years?
It hasn't. My approach to story hasn't changed that much. It's still a focus of what I do. I started working on a graphic novel, which is really daunting. It's very complex, and I'm having to spend a lot of time writing, which is going along into that. But I think that one thing that the pandemic, if there was a way that it affected my idea of narrative, is how much narrative we get from like digital sources. When you're stuck at home and you can't leave, I wasn't going out and talking with people. I was reading a lot of stuff online. I was watching stuff online, and then having conversations through digital media with people. And so I realized how much of the narratives, contemporary narratives, are told through a device now, rather than sitting around talking about it with other people. We're doing it through this, and in one way, it's really interesting because it opened up the world to everybody. So like having when I started doing figure drawing online, and I started having to find models to model through my classes. Because that process it's a lot closer to like setting up shots for like a film than it is in a classroom. In a classroom, I can just work with the model right there and we can get the poses down. But when it's done over Zoom, they have to set cameras up. And so, some of the models I would work with, it would literally be like they would put tape down, like this is my mark for this pose, and this is my mark for this pose, and this is where the camera's gonna go. Which meant I had a lot of conversations pre-class with models and got to know them wherever they were. So if I'm talking to like I worked with a couple called the Life Drawing Duo out of southern Spain and Mediterranean area. And so it was really fascinating to talk to them about what's going on where they were, or talking to like a model in the UK or a model in the East Coast of the United States. And so their stories were things that kind of resonated, because we would have these conversations about how they were dealing with the pandemic and what they were doing and all of that. And so it wasn't me just in Little Rock, Arkansas, knowing what my friends in Little Rock are going through. It was like I was getting this idea of what it was like everywhere. And so that, I think, if there was one thing that came out of the pandemic and how it influenced my idea of narrative, it was that. It enlarged it. It gave me kind of a broader view of things.
That is fascinating. Is that tied to, so one of the things, and I'll add in links for our previous two interviews, your exhibit. I'll add in all the links for everything. And then you did one at Nexus that I wanted to bring up too, that I thought was really fascinating, because that's done now, right? But that was just every day kind of snapshots of people, right? Or were those out of that was just out of your head?
They were characterizations, is what they were. So one of the things I like about going out, I like to go sketch, like in coffee houses and stuff, and that was something that went away with the pandemic, and it's been nice to kind of be able to do that a little bit, although I haven't done it nearly as much as I did before the pandemic. That hasn't come back yet in the way it was before, but growing up on comics, the idea of creating characters is always really fun for me. And I was trying to come up with what I was going to do for that exhibition. It was kind of, I was really frustrated with everything I was doing at the time. And I was like, I don't really want to do this. I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this. And I'd done a little character sketch for actually a role playing game, because I played role playing games and stuff. And my partner Chris, she came in, and we were having a conversation in my studio, and I was talking about how frustrated I was. She's like, "Do that," and she pointed at the character. And I was like, "What, that?" She's like, "Do that." I was like, she's like, "You had fun drawing that. I know you did." And I was like, "Oh, I did." And so I was like, "Okay." So I started thinking about it, and with it being at a coffee house, I was like, "Well, wouldn't it be interesting to come up with all these characters based on like snippets of people I've seen at coffee houses and stuff like that?" And all the sketches had coffee somewhere in the sketch. Like some of the characters had tattoos, and it would have like coffee in the tattoo or stuff like that. And others were actually holding coffee. And then I tried to come up with these ideas of their identities as if they were presented through social media. So a lot of the titles would be their social media handle if they were like on Instagram or something like that. And it gave insight into who the character was and that sort of thing. So I was kind of merging all of those things together to make that show. But the character designs were very cartoony, and it was designed to be that way. So it was a lot of fun to do that. Yeah.
And then you had them showing at a coffee
And then I
shop,
had 'em
yeah,
at a
which
coffee
is like,
shop, yeah.
full circle.
Uh-huh.
That is really cool, and I think that also speaks to how sometimes we do need like outside voices, like with Chris, of someone saying, why don't you do this? Where you're too close to it. For you, it was just like a little random sketch, right?
Right.
And then it became something so much
Yeah.
bigger.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah,
really cool.
it's great to invite people in, I think, and get them to do that. I like to tell students a lot of times, in the visual arts, we have critiques where, you put work up, and then a group of artists, or, if it's in a classroom, we, the other students and the instructor, will all look at the work and give critical feedback. They'll talk about like what they think works, what it doesn't. And it's more than just saying, I like this or I don't like this. It's like really going and saying, well, when I look at the composition, I'm not sure that the asymmetrical balance you were looking for is working the way you think it is. It's more technical kind of stuff. But I've always tried to tell students too, and this goes into kind of what happened with Chris coming in and pointing that out, is always get non-artists to look at your work too. I had a drawing years ago where I had several artist friends look at it, and they were giving me all that technical stuff. And then I had a non-artist friend come in and look at it, and she took 1 minute, and it was like this pastel drawing of these colors, and she said, "That color is bird vomit." I was like, "You were correct, it is. All the artists missed it." But she, just came in and just said, "That's what that color looks like to me." And so I fixed it, because I didn't want to put the color of bird vomit or whatever up on the walls.
A little bit of a mood breaker.
Yeah. And so, but that idea of having someone come in sometimes and point something out to you that you can't see, because you're right, there's too many things going on in your studio, there's too many things you're thinking about, you can't see sometimes those small things, is really helpful to have that voice.
I often describe that to my dog training clients as, if you are trying to hang the picture, you can't see if it's crooked or not.
Yeah.
So someone's having a step back while you're holding it can really help direct you and kind of give you that little bit of feedback just like that.
Yeah,
so
that's a
it is
great way to,
helpful.
yeah.
We can't see all the things, and something that people tell me all the time, like, why didn't I think of that? Well, you can't think of everything. You're just one person. So that's really helpful, and something good to keep in mind. I think for people who are just starting out, that might be a little bit more nerve-wracking, because you, with your experience, that's something you're used to doing and you need it, right? Of like, please give me feedback. What advice do you have for someone who would like to get feedback but they're nervous about asking people for feedback?
Give the work space. I think part of the problem we have is that, like, if you're stuck in a drawing, you're stuck in a piece you're making, you're often very involved in that piece at the time, and sometimes you can be very emotionally invested in it too. And one of the things that I think helps is to simply put it away for a while. And that while might just be a couple of days, or it might be a couple of weeks, but literally take the work away from the drafting table, away from the easel, wherever you're making it, and put it away where you can't see it. And so you stop thinking about it as much. And it's not always there, consciously bothering you. And after that, then pull it out, reassess it yourself, and then get someone to look at it, because you've given yourself some space. There's a preciousness that comes with making, and right at the moment of making things is when it's the most precious. And so you don't want that like negative wallop on you when you've just made this thing, you spent all this time. So if you can give it some space and distance, then it doesn't have that kind of impact, that it might not hit you as hard. And so that's always, to me, the easiest thing is just give it a little bit of breathing room and then come back to it.
So that would help with the emotions of like, this is my newborn baby creation, being
Yes.
gentle with it, and they take it and throw it at the wall. So,
Yeah.
okay. So.
Yeah, with artists, we actually, part of the training we go through is to learn how to develop the ability to withstand the critique. I mean, because you have to. I mean, if you want people to come in and look, I always tell people, you're going to be a visual artist. It's visual. You're going to be out there. You have to put yourself in front of everybody. They have to see it because it's visual art.
Yeah.
And so that's part of the thing is how do you kind of give yourself a little bit of a thick skin so you're not as bothered by it. When I was getting my undergraduate degree, I had this kind of epiphany during a class critique one time where I had my work up on the wall and the whole class is going through and everybody's saying all these different things and the teacher's saying things. And I just sat there and I realized they can't see a fraction of the things wrong with it that I can. And it was like, I was like, I am the only one in the room that truly knows what this is supposed to look like. And no one else can truly know that. And so it was one of those things where I was like, that to me took all the pressure of critique off because I realized I will always see far more wrong with it than anyone else will. And so it made it much easier on me to go into a critique because I can just put it up there and go, well, let's see what everyone else sees. They may see something I don't. And that made it easier on me, but that may not work for everybody either.
And I think that is, that's really helpful, I think, in general for people, because sometimes we do that to ourselves, right? We're the ones staring at ourselves the most. We can tear ourselves apart. We see all the things that are imperfect with us. But when we're out and about and people look at us, they don't see those same things or they don't care about those same things. So I think that's just a really helpful thing to think about in general.
Yeah, I guess it is, yeah.
So, and I do want to point out, so not everybody is going to create art for it to be observed, and it's okay for people to create art just for yourself. Where do you feel it's important for someone to take that step and present it to the world, and where it's okay for them just to keep it inside?
It's interesting that you asked me that because I actually had a friend ask me earlier today. They have an acquaintance who has a child that's, I think, contemplating art school, and that's one of those like fundamental questions, right? Is because if you're going to go to college for an art degree, most likely you're wanting to do it as a professional. And there is something to the idea of making something just for yourself and just enjoying the process. And we try to tell everybody, make the art for you, and then once it's done, then figure out how to do the professional stuff with it. But, because otherwise you might not, if you're talking about like more fine art, that's kind of what I'm talking about, you want to have, it resonate and be genuine. It's a little different when you get into like commercial art where you're doing something for clients. That's more of a collaborative process, but
and a more painful process.
And it can be more painful, yes. But if you are someone who likes to make, you don't have to do it professionally. But at the same time, I think that it's helpful to still go learn all the techniques and learn the things so that you don't get frustrated by the process. If it's something you enjoy, then learn it and make it so that it's comfortable to do rather than uncomfortable. And show it if you want to show it, or don't. And I don't remember where I learned this years ago, but there was someone who was talking about, most people know the term writer's block, right? But visual artists can get the same thing, where it's just like we get blocked up and we don't know what to do next or where to go next and stuff like that. And a lot of times it stems from things become too precious. They become, every work you're trying, sometimes it's called like masterpiece syndrome. Every time you sit down, you're trying to create a masterpiece instead of just make something. And one of the solutions I saw a long time ago, and I actually did this early in my career and it helped, was to fill a sketchbook up with drawings and throw it away. I mean, you want to talk about, like, I just spent all this time filling the sketchbook up and then throw it in the trash.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's really daunting, but it's also like, if I have the ability to do that, I can let go of anything I'm making. So if you're someone that wants to be, like, do it professionally, to put your work out there and show or anything, even if you're just semi-professional or whatever, you have to have that same ability to throw it in the trash. could you take the work and get rid of it? Because when it's on the wall, everyone's going to say what they think about it, and you have to be able to step away from. You know, I've heard so many crazy comments about my work over my career where they didn't know I was the artist, and I'm standing at the opening, and they're in front of me talking about the work, and I'm just like, this is wild. All the things they're saying. So you have to be able to get that, you know, that ability to just let it roll off you, or it can be bothersome. Yeah.
So is it really a process of separating your personhood from what you create? Because that temptation is like, I am my creation, instead of I am a distinct person and I will always be creating, and it's not.
Yeah, I think a lot of people get tied up that they are their work and their work is them, and I don't always ascribe to that. Part of this comes, and this is an interesting conversation I've been having with Diane Harper, actually. She and I talk a lot about art, and we've been having this conversation lately about, I think right now there is this idea in the visual arts that when you see a piece of art, it has a piece of the artist in it, or it's channeling that artist, or, you know, this idea of whether it's genuine or not. There's a lot of you have to be really careful with, like, are you appropriating something as an artist? Am I taking a symbol from somebody that I shouldn't, that I don't really have a right to use, and putting it in my work or something like that? And so I think a lot of artists have gotten to the idea of, well, I just make work that's me, that's my work kind of thing. But what's fascinating is, like, I was also a creative writing major for a long time, and I did a lot of writing. And one of my teachers, fantastic teacher, David Giles, said, you probably always heard the, you know, write what you know. He always said, start with what you know and make the rest up from there. As a creative writer, that makes a lot more sense, right? I'll start with this little nugget of information that I know, and then I'm going to build something on top of that, and that allows for investigation. And so, like, he has this really great kind of, like, writer's bio that talks a little bit about, you know, I think it's an introduction to one of his writing books, I think, and it talks about, like, you know, he's like, I've been, you know, this kind of person and this person and this person. They're all people not like him, but writing gave him the ability to investigate that and become someone different. And I think visual artists can do the same thing, and that goes to what you're talking about with that separation. And so when I'm making work, especially when it's narrative work, I'm trying to figure out who someone else is. I'm trying to figure that character. When I was doing those coffee characters, those people aren't me, but it gave me a chance to explore how those people might be and how they're reacting to the world. And so I put it out there. And so therefore, if I'm putting my work out there, it's not me hanging on the wall, it's just a creation I've made. There's parts of me in it, but it's not all me. And I think that's the distinction you have to make as an artist.
That is really fascinating, too, because I think that also leads to a lot of growth when you can step into someone else's shoes and see through the world through their eyes, and you understand that they're going to look at things differently than you and, like, care about different things than you. Then I think that also allows for a lot more compassion.
Yes.
As an artist, I feel like when you're doing art right, you are some of the most compassionate, sensitive people, because you have this perspective of the world that the normal person doesn't have when they're not doing that actively.
Right. I think that, you know, in a lot of the, like the work, the artwork I worry about a lot is stuff that's like social justice art and stuff like that, because that art is desperately needed and it needs to be used to highlight things. But to me, I think far too often it's used as a blunt instrument. I'm just going to put this out there and hit you with it and say, this is a problem. And instead of, like, casting it through like the eyes of a person, to allow the viewer to put themselves in that person's shoes or stuff like that. And it's hard to do that, I understand that. But I think, to me, that's when it becomes more powerful, is when you create that experience where I can look at something and go, I understand now how that person feels, instead of just basically putting something out there that's yelling at people about something. And so it's a tough, you know, tough road to travel, and I get that, but it's also like, isn't that one of the challenges that, you know, can be so rewarding too, is when you do make the piece where people go, I understand.
And I think when we look at trauma, like for example, the earthquake that happened in Turkey, there's just so many videos and photos of people just sitting with their loved ones' dead bodies. And it's like, can't we be more respectful than that? Can't we sit with them in that? Why do we have to just consume this? Can we find ways to help them that's not about exploiting their pain? It is, I just don't understand. I don't think that people understand how devastating and traumatic these events are when we're just consuming, and people are just yelling about it. How do we honor those deaths and that trauma without exploiting it?
Well, I think too the problem is that often when we look at like an event like you're talking about, we focus too much on the event, and the thing is, it's the things that happen before and after that are what you deal with as a human being, right? It's what was your life before the event, and what's it like after? Was it before you lose that person, how did you feel or experience life? And when they're gone, how do you deal with it? And to me, when you look at some of the great books and like movies that talk about this, it's that event is rarely a big part of the story. It's everything that happens after.
The Last of Us. Have you been?
I have not seen that.
Oh my goodness. So when you talk about like, I think the game does it just as well. I think the TV show does it really well too. They have like the inciting incident, what happened before, then they skip over, and then it's 20 years later, and just dealing with the aftermath and all of that too, and just how the whole story, the game, I think in the TV series, how it deals with these dramatic events, like the zombies are just part of this, the story of humanity. Like that's really all it is. So if you do have a chance, I really recommend it. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. But that's just exactly what it reminded me of, is like how do we delve in to the deep humanity of these people and how they were impacted in their emotions and why they make the decisions they do. I think The Last of Us does it so well.
I'm a big fan of like the horror genre, and the reason I like it isn't just for like the kind of thrill that comes from being scared or something. It's exactly what you're talking about. Often, whatever the thing is that is designed to scare or create fear, it's there to create the reaction, and it's the reaction of the characters that make it genuine. That how they react to a situation, how they react to something, and then how they grow from it. And to me, that's always far more interesting. And what I liked about it, is that idea that we grow and transform from this. We find out parts of who we are that we didn't know before, and that sort of thing. And I think you can apply that to fiction, you can apply it to nonfiction, whichever way you want to go. And to me, when I look at a lot of contemporary art, to me that's part of what's missing, is that aspect of it. We're not talking about what's happening after, we're talking about the thing, and not talking about the humanity that goes around it.
Yep, and what drives it. I think a good example of that is The Babadook. So I did not like horror until I watched that film, because it was like he was a physical representation of grief, and how they explore that. I think other really great examples of that are The Haunting of Hill House too, and just how they explore the humanity of these people and what their motivations are and how their environment impacts them. So I think horror done well is stunning, stunning insight into humanity and how we're motivated and how we grow or we don't.
Done poorly, it's really awful.
Oh yeah. Oh my goodness. My older sister was obsessed with like the Saw movies, so we just watched like trauma incessantly, and I was just like, horror is the worst. And then I started seeing these beautifully done works, and I was like, wow, horror done well is truly stunning.
Well, that's why I think The Walking Dead resonated with a lot of people, the same kind of thing, because it wasn't really about the fact that like there were The Walking Dead. I mean, they were part of it. It was more that you had these people trying to figure out how to survive and interact with each other, and often the conflicts aren't them with the undead, it's them with each other, and it gives you a chance to examine humanity that way.
Yeah, I think Judith is a big example of that. Of like, doesn't matter who her father was, like Rick was going to love her and take care of her no matter what. And that that bond, she was what he had left. So yeah, I absolutely agree. Well, philosophical. So share a little bit to bring this back around. What are you working on now? What would you like to promote? How are you continuing to make your work your career?
There's a lot to that. I'm doing a lot of teaching, which I'm really enjoying. I'm teaching classes on my own. I teach through the organizations I work for, like UA Little Rock or the Arkansas Museum of Fine Arts, and I'm doing workshops here and there, and that's fun for me because it allows me, one, I like to share stuff with people and help them develop and improve, but at the same time, teaching is one of those things that helps you remind yourself of what you're doing, and a lot of the work that I do is coming out of that. I've enjoyed doing a lot of figure drawing. It was a thing that helped get me through the pandemic, but I'm not doing as much of it as I was because it's just I did a lot of it. Mm-hmm. And so I'm turning more back towards that narrative kind of stuff again, and getting into doing some things. I'm working on a show that'll be at Gallery 26 this summer with Diane Harper and I, and right now the concept I think is going to be really fun for both of us. I don't want to say anything yet.
Okay, we'll see. We'll give socials on where to follow and how to do it. Yeah.
But it's I'll say this, I'm going back and looking at old work I've done and re-examining it and finding things to bring from that old work into what I'm doing now, which is really, like looking at stuff I did 15 years ago and stuff like that. Well, what was I doing? How was I doing it? And then I'm trying to bring some of those elements back. Because you as an artist, you do that where things change and you drop some things and you pick up new things and all that. And so I'm trying to go back and find some of those older things and maybe bring them back into what I'm doing again. But the story is still there. I've been working on like a series of images that are, I'm calling my storybook series, where they're just these one-off like poster designs, but each one is really narrative. And there's like a central character with a lot of symbolic content. So they're designed, I like to try to make visual art you have to read, so to speak, where you have to look at it and say, okay, there's all these flowers, and the flowers look like a rose. What does that mean exactly in this context? Or I'll put little things like a framed picture that's upside down, or there's books, or the character has an apple, and what does that mean? Like I like to put little things like that in there. So while I might try to design it to be aesthetically pleasing, I really want it to be where someone spends time and has to kind of decode it and go, okay, what does this mean exactly? And try to figure out how all those things relate and that sort of thing. And then look at the title and go, okay, maybe I have some idea of what's here. But I also try to leave it ambiguous enough that they can put some of themselves into it as well. So, and those are hard to do because
it's a lot of mental work.
Yeah, right. There's a lot of work that goes in. I have to solve a lot of problems. There's a lot of prep that goes into it. Whereas like the figure drawing, I can just sit down and bam, I can crank out these drawings, working for the model, which is a lot of fun. It's the figure drawing for me is a lot more of like just a fun process, just a relaxation. I can go in and just do this because I've done it so much. Those pieces are the ones where I sit down and say, okay, I want to talk about maybe loss, or I want to talk about finding who you are, and how do I do that subtly through the imagery that I'm creating. It might be, like I like to use tattoos. I think tattoos are a great way to put something where you're literally putting something on the person that tells you who they are. Or, maybe the clothes they're wearing, stuff like that. What it's the environment they're in. Like I've been getting into stuff like old paper dolls. Like some of the illustrations I've been doing lately, some of the drawings I'm doing, like when I just did, the buildings all look like they're cardboard cutouts in the background instead of real buildings. So this idea of using images that we understand, like buildings, but then putting them in a context where it looks like paper doll stuff, to play with that kind of imagery and see what people get out of it. So that's kind of where my work's been going lately, and we'll see what keeps going.
Yeah, it's so fun to follow along and see what you're working on. I really loved the coffee shop characters and all of that. You're just really thoughtful in what you put together and how you express it. So it's fun to go on that journey. Well, where can people find you? How do they follow along with what you're working on?
You can always go to my website, which is rbfineart.com, or you can follow me on Instagram at rbfineart. Those are generally the two places I post stuff regularly. I have a mailing list too, and I think you can sign up for it on my website.
You can, yes, okay. Verified.
Yeah.
That's what I did.
Okay, so you can sign up there, and I send emails out every few weeks. I don't send a lot out, but that's usually like if I have a class coming up, I'll send it through that with a way to register, or if I've got an exhibition coming up, it'll go into that. That's the easiest way to keep up with what I'm doing.
Perfect. Well, is there anything else that you would like to add?
I don't think so. I mean, this is always fun to talk about. I like coming in and having a conversation with you about this kind of stuff.
Yeah,
So
I appreciate you doing it. It's always a pleasure, and it's kind of fun to see how this project has morphed for me and for other people to come on that journey with me and share their own journey. So I really appreciate it. Well, such a pleasure, Robert. I really enjoy chatting with you. You have such great insights, I think, not only into art, but into the human experience, which is always really fun to interact with. So we know where to find you. We kind of know what's happening, how to follow along. And then I have a question for you. I'm going to do the sign off. And at the end, I have a question for you about kind of people who are curious about getting into art.
Okay.
This has been Sustaining Craft with your host, Elizabeth Silverstein, and guest Robert Bean. Music has been provided by Jim Chiago. And before we sign off completely, Robert, what advice do you have for someone who is curious about maybe stepping into the art world or learning how to draw or paint or whatever, but feel like they don't have any talent to do so?
I would say this, that talent is built. I think we have a real problem with that myth of like the genius. I mean, they do exist, but drawing is a skill, painting is a skill, and you don't have to have all this talent in the world to learn it. If you can learn how to do other things in your life, you can learn how to draw. It's just a matter of, are you willing to put in the time and the effort to do it? People, I think they see, one of the things, if you're a good artist, it looks easy because you put it out there and it looks really polished, and it's like, oh, okay. And you know, if they watch you draw, it looks like, oh, they just have talent, they know how to do this. But for someone who's trying to learn it, you really do have to go back to those basics and say, okay, how does the pencil work? How does this work? And you have to learn all that stuff. So my advice is, if you're interested in doing it, be patient, give it time, and understand it's a skill you're going to learn and develop, and it takes time to do it. It doesn't usually happen quickly.